attorneys, for the district and for the parents got together. And so they did a lot of case review, and they actually did a year in review. And they reviewed some summaries of the case law. And you're probably thinking, well, why is case law so important? Well, it drives the laws, the regulations, and kind of our guidance from PDE, or Pennsylvania Department of Ed, and other educational resources of just how this law should state or what our children are entitled to. And the big hot topic of the conference was now our children who would have thought to age out at 21 are now aging out at 22. So there are some, clarification points that need to be made for that yet. Because of, again, it seems like sometimes we get some information and then it's not quite clear yet how that would look. So for anyone who has a young adult that still receives special education services, that is the newer news coming from the conference. Also, there's some other news that I'm going to try to hit on. So it's pretty fresh in my brain. So I will hit it while I can. So I'm going to go ahead here and start. And I did this in alphabetical order just because it's easier for me to remember. And there's a lot of slides. So if I go fast, please slow me down. Okay, so we're going to start with ABA, applied behavior analysis. It is a therapy based on the science of learning and behavior. So we see a lot more of ABA clinics, ABA becoming a staple within our public schools, within private schools, and it is a way of addressing some behaviors and ways to teach our students some functional skills as well as some academic skills. ADA, I encourage everyone to be familiar with this. It's our Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's our basis, our primary civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all public environments. And I think it's very important that we recognize this as our foundation. This is kind of what has started and has recognized that, individuals with disabilities are individuals too, and they should have the same rights and responsibilities as anyone else in public spaces. ADD, attention deficit disorder. So I know some of us are primarily focused with somebody in our life that has Down syndrome, but this is a comorbid condition, meaning that it can exist with other conditions, disabilities, and disorders. And so we're looking at inattention, but not hyperactivity or impulsivity. Now, ADHD is where we see that hyperactivity and impulsivity in addition to the individual's ability to focus. Again, that's another comorbid condition or coexisting condition that can be alongside something else. APE, this is kind of an interesting one. People call it APE. I'm like, nope, it's APE. It's adaptive physical education. And I know some of our friends and our loved ones with Down syndrome may qualify for any modified or adapted physical education instruction to meet the need for the individual with a disability. Now, a lot of families aren't aware or don't know that this even exists. So I encourage to inquire about this with your school. If your school does not provide it, I know around here our intermediate unit provides it. And so there's ways to access that service that's not right within the district. ASD, and this is close, near and dear to my life. Both my sons are on the autism spectrum. They're 13 and 16, and it's a developmental disability impacting communication and social interaction. And there's more to it. I know that's not our focus tonight, but that's just a little synopsis of it. ASL, American Sign Language. It's our visual language that the brain processes linguistics information via the eyes. And so I know there are a lot of people that use ASL for their infant toddlers, individuals with disability, ranging in need and disability category. So it's a great way to start our youngsters off when they're not able to produce those vocal sounds, or individuals who are apraxic. who just don't make that connection from the brain to the physical spaces of their mouth to speak. AT, this is a good one. And a lot of people have a misconception about AT. They call it a talk box, meaning the iPad with dynamic touch screen display with an app that speaks when it is activated. But keep in mind, assistive technology is any item, piece of equipment, or software program used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of an individual. Now, I want to just stop there because when we look at AT, we look at low tech and high tech. And I think this is where the misconception comes in, because high tech are the iPads with that app that, when activated, speaks. But there's also low tech, and we're going to hit that a little bit later in some of the other acronyms. But low tech could be a picture exchange system. It could be something that is pre-recorded, like a button that you touch. It could be something simple as visual pictures that represent things for the individual. So when we're talking about assistive technology, it could also be adapted seating. It could be a pencil grip. It doesn't necessarily have to be tech as we are defined, as we define tech now. So be very open-minded when somebody says that to you, that it could mean a multitude of things. AYP, adequate yearly progress. This is another, oh, I see a hand. Thanks, Masha.
I just had a question. Would a cell phone be considered? I know you mentioned an iPad, so is a cell phone possible to be used if that's, within the plan and kind of discussed? Okay.
Yes, actually, I just was working with a family that the individual, they were actually teaching the individual how to use the cell phone appropriately for whether it's calling for help or after practice, mom or dad or whomever needed to pick him up, using the cell phone, the calculator device, if he or she was not able to, do the mental math. The other one was, how to make a phone call, how to send a text. So it was very functional, what we would consider basic, but for this individual, it was a skill that needed to be taught. So that was assistive technology in that definition. Good question, Masha. Thank you. AYP, this is really important. This is adequate yearly progress. And this is the measurement defined by No Child Left Behind Act. And we're going to look at what NCLB is later. It permits the Department of Ed to determine how every public school or LEA is performing academically according to standardized testing. So a lot of people talk to me about standardized testing, the PSSAs and the PASA, and we're going to get to that a little later. But there's lots of reasons for these standardized testing. This is one of them. School districts have to show that there has been adequate progress made within a year. And if not, there are certain action steps that have to be taken by the district or the LEA to remediate that. So let me give you an example. Pennsylvania Department of Ed provides designations. And so there's a school district that I'm currently working with now that one of the designations, meaning they did not meet the adequate yearly progress, was within a certain subgroup. It happened to be the ELL and Hispanic group. And so now there are action steps put in place by the state to assist that school district into remediation. That's called ATSI. And that's another acronym, and I will not get into that. But the next step then is CSI. And so, there are levels of severity if, that school district does not remediate those situations. So that was just an example there. I know that got a little technical, and I'm sorry, but I like to explain this to parents and other people, because sometimes we do get a little bit of flack of all the state testing, but there are some reasons behind it. Okay, behavior intervention plan. And this is a plan to replace problem behaviors with positive behaviors based off of an FBA, functional behavior assessment. So I'm going to pause on this for a little bit. A behavior plan is a result of an FBA. If you see a behavior plan associated with your child or loved one and there's no FBA, there needs to be a question. Where's the FBA? Because all behavior has a function. All behavior is communication. And so if a child is demonstrating certain behaviors, there's a reason. He or she is trying to communicate something or express something in some way. And the only way to know that is if there's a functional behavior assessment and a plan that is written with that FBA in mind. All right, CBM, CBA. It's a curriculum-based measure or assessment. Those terms can be used interchangeably. So when you see your child's evaluation or you see within the IEP, CBM, CBA, know that it's a district or it's curriculum or it's a product that uses some form of assessment, whether it shows a Lexile score, meaning a reading score, or if it shows WPM, words per minute. So that's how many words your child reads within a minute. So those are all key terms to kind of look for in this documentation, because it shows you what is the district doing to assess your child's skills, and then how are they reporting it. I know sometimes we're so overwhelmed with the sections of an evaluation or an IEP that we're just kind of, okay, all right, so great. They can read 40 words per minute, but can they answer comprehension questions? CBMs and CBAs are meant to measure these skills within that scope. CCSS, Common Core State Standards. All right, so Pennsylvania does use state standards. And if you ever want to look them up when you're bored or have some extra time, I encourage you to go to the SAS website, SAS website. It is the state standard website, and you can Google, or not Google, you can search any standard, if it's ELA, math, if it's social, whatever the standard is, that is all there, spelled out by grade level. Now, for our some of our individuals with special needs, they may be eligible for the alternative content standards. And so there's a section there. So if your child takes the alternative form of state testing, which we'll get to in a little bit, those are the standards they will be working from. And I just want to be clear on that, because there are some hiccups sometimes on, you know, my child is really needing functional skills. My child needs to learn how to use the toilet, how to tie their shoes, how to wash their hands, but yet this teacher is working on fractions. And that was a real life situation I was faced with in the classroom. I had students that needed functional daily living skills, but yet I am bound to teach to the standards. And so one of the ways I taught fractions was during cooking class, and we used measuring cups and measuring spoons. So there are ways to do things like that that are appropriate. So I like to work with schools and work with my younger teachers on just how we can teach those fractions, but in a more functional way for some of our kiddos. So it's our initiative from 2010 that provides the details and aligns all those content areas. And they're supposed to be known by the end of the school year. All right, so some of our children have occupational therapy, and sometimes we come up to COTA and we're like, what's that mean? Certified Occupational Therapist Assistant. I'm sorry, assistant's not on there. They help our occupational therapists do evaluations, consultations, direct therapy, because let's face it, we are very short numbered when it comes to our therapist, and I give them a big round of applause because they do a lot for our children, our speech therapists, our OTs, and our physical therapist. CP, cerebral palsy, and it's a group of disorders that impacts the individual's ability to move, maintain balance, and posture. And CYS and CPS, those terms, depending on the county, they're kind of used interchangeably. It's a system of intervention for child abuse and neglect. And so there's a whole system on how to report that. And if you're ever interested, Childline has a very user-friendly website that I encourage people to just kind of take a look at. As teachers and people that work with individuals with special needs, we're mandated reporters. And I just like to remind people of that. If you see something, say something. Sometimes people see DD, developmental disabilities, and it's a group of conditions, and there's a large group actually with impairment in physical learning, language, and behavioral areas. Deaf and hard of hearing, I don't see this one a lot anymore, but sometimes I do occasionally see it. So that's the standard, or that's an acronym for that. And DOE. I've been having a couple cases with this lately, where it's determination of eligibility. And so what I'm seeing a lot of is districts are evaluating students and they are not finding that the student is eligible for an IEP, but instead they're covered under the Rehabilitation Act and a 504 plan. There's a difference between those documents. We'll get into that a little bit later. But what can be kind of confusing is how the student is determined, or the eligibility determination. So I wanted to go over this real quick, and it is a law, and it has certain criteria that states to qualify for special education services, there's a two-prong approach. A child must have one of the 13 disabilities defined in IDEA, and that's a law. So I'm going to get to that in a little bit. And the impact of the disability must create a need for services. And I like to hit on that a little bit harder, because just because a child has a disability does not necessarily mean that they have an educational need for services. And sometimes I have parents call me and they're very upset and they don't understand. Well, one, it was never explained to them what this means and that there's a two-prong approach. And two, that we're, as parents, we're not in our son or daughter's or our child's classroom. We don't see what it is they're experiencing or they're doing. And so sometimes that's not 100% explained to us by the people who do see them every day in the classroom, in the learning environment. And so a lot of times parents see something different than the educators see. And that's kind of hard to explain sometimes. And I use this example, like my sons are excellent students in school. They do have some deficits and do have needs, but the way they act at home, they're in their safe space. So when they need to have a meltdown or they need to stim or whatever it is they have to do, they feel free to do it here. So I like to share that story a little bit with parents, and the DOE, the determination of eligibility, is definitely a sticking point for a lot of my cases and clients. All right, so DS Down syndrome. And I don't think I need to explain it here. If you want me to, I will. But I will say that it has been an amazing blessing working with the Down Syndrome Association of Pittsburgh, because I have learned a lot. And it's been an amazing experience, an eye-opening experience. And yeah, wow, these kiddos are amazing, and young adults. So DSI, dual sensory impairment. This is kind of a newer one, because keep in mind, sensory processing disorder is still not yet recognized as the DSM-5. And for those of you who don't know that, that's our book that gives us all our diagnoses and our descriptions for criteria. And so dual sensory impairment is not the same as sensory processing disorder. And I just wanted to clarify that. When I look at dual sensory impairment, we're looking at impairments that impact both like vision and hearing, and that causes the inability to acquire information, communication, and function within the education environment. So when we say sensory, it's not sensory processing, it's as in sensory processing disorder. It's sensory as in vision and hearing. So I want to clarify that one as well too. Okay, emotional disturbance. We've seen some more recognition in this area as mental health. Mental health has definitely been more recognized lately, which is, something that we've been waiting on for a long time. We're starting to normalize that, mental health is a thing, and we need to address it, and we need to, see it, the younger, the better. And I know not all of these things are apparent right off the bat. They have later onset, whether it's puberty or young adult. But I'm very proud that these are starting to get recognized, and we're starting to see more and more improvement in movement this way. Emotional disturbance, ED, condition that exhibits one or more of the following for a long period of time and adversely impacts education. And you'll notice as I go through here, these 13 disability categories always say after it, and adversely impacts education, or significantly impacts education. Remember, it's always that two-prong approach, having the disability through an evaluation and an official diagnosis, and there's evidence, clear, adverse impact in the education setting. But I like to go over this emotional disturbance because we are, again, seeing more and more movement in this area. But inability to learn, not explained by intellectual or sensory or health, inability to maintain interpersonal relationships, inappropriate behaviors. And that's very general. So of course you rely on your team for that more clear definition. General pervasive mood or unhappiness or depression, fears, physical symptoms with personal or educational problems, and schizophrenia. So I'm happy to see that that's all recognized now. EI, early intervention, programs for infant and toddlers who are developmentally delayed, and they're designed to help prevent further problems as a child matures. And I will say that EI, being a special needs mom, that was probably one of the toughest but most rewarding times of my life. And I give kudos to early intervention teachers and therapists, because it's it's a lot. It's a lot for them. All right. So ELA is considered in Pennsylvania as English language arts. And when you look up the standards, the Common Core standards, that's what you'll look up for anything to do with reading. ELL and EL, English language learner or English learner. It's a student who's learning English as a second language in addition to their native language. Here's another important one, ER, evaluation report. So there's a lot to say here, but the gist is written document developed by the team. So let me say that one more time. Team. Summarizing information gathered from members' assessment results, and is used to determine the student's eligibility and need for special education. So as parents, you are part of the team. If you ever feel that you are not part of the team, speak up, say something, because all through these written documentations, you are a team member and your voice matters. Too often, my parents and the clients I work with are given thick documents that they never had a single say or input in there. That's not right. You are a team member. So I want just to hit that home as hard as I can, because your input in the evaluation and in the child's IEP, it matters. All right, and this is the big piece of legislation we have here, ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It's an act that emphasizes equal access to education, aiming, excuse me, where's my screen? Give me 1 second. There we go. Aiming to shorten the achievement gaps between students by providing federal funding to support schools with children from impoverished families. This was a really big act for us to try to level the playing field, especially with funding, distributing funding to schools. ESL, English as a second or foreign language. And I'm not sure about anybody else, but I am seeing, and I'm very happy to see, a lot of our kiddos coming from different countries and sharing spaces with us, and the camaraderie that we're seeing just in my school district. Our Spanish-speaking population has significantly increased, and it's so cool to watch each other, those children interact and share languages and share cultures. And it was funny, I did lunch duty, and they were sharing cultural foods, and I was like, I don't know about that, for food allergies and stuff, but I thought it was awesome just to kind of hear them talking about it. And I was just like, yes, this is awesome. Great experience for them. All right, ESSA, this is another big piece of legislation, a law that replaced No Child Left Behind. So if I get a little caught up in these laws a little bit, please just stop me, because it's a lot to kind of keep up with what law changed, what regulation changed, who replaced what. So if it gets confusing, please stop me. But NCLB, or No Child Left Behind, and it was the reauthorization of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And this established the federal government's expanded role in public education. So keep in mind, before the 1960s, there was kind of this limbo of the federal government's role in education. And so they pretty much gave a lot of power to the states, each individual state, and in Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth, to kind of control or manage their special education and their education departments. But as we see with No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act, more and more federal regulations, federal funding, and more involvement has come about. ESY, this is another important point I like to touch on for a couple reasons. My screen keeps going in and out, so I apologize ahead of time. You guys are not having any issues seeing it, right? No? Okay. All right. Sorry about that. ESY, it's a delivery of special education and related services during the summer or other extended periods when school is not in session. And it's used to maintain academic, social, behavioral, communication, or other skills addressed within IEPs or Section 504 plans. So I'm not sure if everyone is aware that it's not just for ELA and math skills. It's for other skills too, whether it's social, behavior, or communication. And a good example that I like to share is I had a student that was doing great academically, but within the last month of school, a new assistive technology device was placed with that student. And so we determined as an IEP team that this was a pivotal learning time regarding communication, because it was not right to just send home a child for the summer with a brand new assistive technology device without or with little instruction. And so that student qualified for ESY under those circumstances. And there are 7 factors that determine ESY. So please make sure that at your meetings, you're discussing those factors. And if your meeting's like in the beginning of the school year, I always ask or encourage families to revisit that conversation in, I'd say about January, just kind of touch base a little bit, be like, hey, how are we feeling about ESY? There is a time limit, where we have to determine when that is appropriate. But I like to open the conversation back up, because a lot can change over a school year. And so what is determined in the fall may not necessarily be true come mid-year or springtime. But again, a meeting for this or through the revision process. And it's definitely individually developed. Please don't ever think that your child having ESY, it's, not individualized, because it is. It's based on their goals and objectives and needs. All right. And the whole premise for special education is FAPE, free, appropriate public education. Our educational programs and related services that are designed on individual needs and allow for meaningful progress. Let me repeat that: meaningful progress. I think that sometimes that part is overlooked because some of our children, their progress happens in smaller steps than other children. But as long as it's meaningful for that child, I don't mean stagnant, and I don't mean maintenance. Meaning, if we're looking at data and it's flat lines and we're not seeing any more increase, that's not necessarily meaningful progress. So I like to point that out to a lot of our parents. And it's provided without charge to parents. So if you are ever asked to pay for anything when it comes to public school, regarding the education and the related services, I think that's a conversation. FBA, we hit a little bit on that earlier tonight, functional behavior assessment. And again, it is the process to determine why behaviors occur. Because remember, behaviors always have a function, they always have a why, and it's usually a form of communication. It shows data collection to determine the behavior causes and identify strategies to address the behaviors. And again, like I said earlier, this FBA morphs all that data and information into a behavior intervention plan. Those two are married together. FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It is our federal law that protects privacy and the transfer of student educational records. So, when your child's IEP is laying on the teacher's desk, if she or he is not right there with it, it should not be laying there on the desk. Certain papers getting transferred back and forth in the backpack folder or the take-home folder. I just caution people sometimes, watch what you're sending home or you're receiving, because that could be, privacy information that should not be being sent home like that. So I always caution my student teachers, especially, like, just be very careful, what information is being passed back and forth. And that includes social media and photos. A lot of times I think, we're social media digital world now, we use a lot of photos for communication. So I just use some caution there. And there are ways school districts and you as a parent or a family or caregiver can prohibit the use of your child's photo and restrict their information. So if you're interested in that, I'll be glad to help you with that. FTE, full-time equivalent. So I get a lot of questions, especially when it comes to, well, there are 8 kids in my daughter's class. So it's called the full-time equivalent. It's a unit that indicates the workload of an employee, or it compares like the student to teacher ratio or class load ratio. So let me give you an example. I am a full-time autistic support teacher. My max student ratio to me is 8. Now, a life skills class is 15. So think about it this way. I know the class in my building, the life skills class in my building, has some children that are very involved, and they have a lot of challenges they have to overcome during the day. And there's 15 bodies in that classroom to one teacher. So I can get into all this, but it's something to think about when you question. I know that was a concern earlier when we were opening up, but just think there are regulations to that. Before we have a discussion on it. That's some things that we probably should look up and know for sure. So anybody, I forget who had that question. I think it was Kathy. Kathy brought that up. So definitely that's a discussion and conversation with your team. G&T, gifted and talented. That kind of pairs nice with the GIEP. And again, this could be something that's occurring. So for example, my sons are diagnosed with ASD. They're diagnosed with a medical condition called von Willebrand's disorder. It's a blood clotting disorder. And they also are considered gifted. So they have those co-occurring diagnoses. Gifted students are considered students who have intellectual abilities significantly above average. And 80 to 100 is kind of your average IQ, that range right there. So they're looking at anything. I believe certain districts have certain cutoffs. The one I'm quoting is like, I think it's 110. But that ranges from different districts, and that's a conversation to have with your LEA. A GIEP looks kind of similar, but not as involved as an IEP for students with disabilities. And again, you can have a GIEP and a regular IEP. Hearing impairment HI. It's an impairment in hearing, whether permanent or fluctuating, that adversely impacts a child's educational performance, but is not under deafness. I like to share this, the part that says fluctuating. So my oldest son, who is 16, he was diagnosed with temporary conductive hearing loss. And when something's temporary, you know, it's expected to go away. But when you have fluctuating, it comes and comes and goes, because we never knew when he was little if he was ever hearing or not. So he didn't necessarily qualify solely under hearing impairment. It was, you know, included within his SDI because he had already had an IEP under an autism diagnosis. But there are situations where, you know, temporary conductive hearing loss, a situation like that could be covered under hearing impairment, again, if it also adversely impacts educational performance. Yes, Masha, I see your hand.
We had another question in the chat. If you could repeat,
Sure.
what is LEA?
LEA. I think that's later in my slide, so I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead. LEA is Local Education Agency. So I use district and LEA interchangeably because they are. Any other questions? All right. All right. HIPAA. HIPAA is another privacy law, and it stands for, and I'm sorry, my screen keeps flickering and I apologize. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and it's U.S. legislation that provides data privacy and security provisions for safeguarding medical information. So if your child does have, you know, medical concerns or medical diagnosis, FERPA is the Educational Privacy Act, but some things do fall under HIPAA under the Medical Act. And I can get into more specifics with you there, but just know those are your two pieces of legislation that protect your child's privacy and also yours. All right, ID, intellectual disability. And when I first started in special education, oh goodness, in 2003, this is before mental retardation was struck from all the records. President Obama in 2012 had all references and use of the term mental retardation struck from the record and replaced with intellectual disability. The definition still being similar: significantly sub-average general intellectual function with deficits in adaptive behavior and manifests during the developmental period, and it adversely impacts educational performance. There's that last clause again. You're going to keep seeing that the rest of the evening. So this is important kind of to keep in the back of your mind as I go through the later slides about state testing. IDEA, I've mentioned this a couple times, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it's a U.S. law that requires accountability, equity, and excellence in education for children with disabilities. And we really saw a lot of accountability come down the pipeline when this was enacted. You know, before there wasn't a lot of ways to show what it is we were doing with individuals with disabilities, and this gave us that accountability that people needed to see what exactly we were doing, what things were working, why did we know it didn't work, and how are you going to change it to hopefully get a better result. IEE. This is another important one. This is a lot of phone calls to me. That an independent education evaluation. It is an evaluation of a child that is performed by personnel outside of the school district for the purposes of determining a special education program. Now, I do get phone calls that parents disagree with the district's reevaluation or evaluation. So this is where I say to parents that you are entitled to an independent education evaluation. However, there's a process to go through. You have to provide a written request. The district then can either decline or honor the request. And then there's a certain panel of personnel that are provided to the parents as an independent evaluator. Now, we did cover this at PBI Institute a couple weekends ago. Some case law has shown that the districts can sit on an IEE evaluation request for up to 3 months. Typically, laws have timelines. For example, if a parent requests an evaluation, the district has to make some sort of movement within 10 days. There is also a 10-day window between the time an ER or an RR is presented to a family and an IEP is developed and implemented. Okay, so typically there are timelines, but what we're seeing and what the cases have shown through hearing officers is that they are not holding districts accountable to a certain timeline for these IEE requests. So I caution parents, that's fine if you want the IEE and you can put in the written request, but please know that districts can sit on that. Now, do most districts sit on them? No, because what can happen is then it puts the burden of proof on the district. Okay. And when you have burden of proof, we're talking about, how, for example, they would have to prove why your child would not be entitled or you're not entitled to that EEE. And that's a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort and resources. So most of the time they are approved, but I like to talk about what we just found out in the last conference. Any questions on that? Okay, cool. An IEP. Would I be safe to say that most of us are pretty familiar with an IEP. It is a big, thick, long document for some of us. 64 pages, I think was the last one I wrote. Just depending on what it all is that needs to be in there. But it's an individual education plan or program, written document developed for each child who has the need for special education. And I'm not going to elaborate more than that. If you have specific questions, I'll be more than happy to answer it. IFSP, I think some of us who have gone through the early intervention birth to 3 stages, 3 to 5, would be familiar with this document as well. An individualized family service plan. It's a family-based needs plan outlining early intervention services for birth to 3 children with special needs. IQ, this is another one we're probably a little familiar with. Intelligence quotient. It's a form of psychological testing to show one's capacity to learn and effectively be effective within their environment. And note that an IQ does not measure everything. It's just one measure. There are so many other areas of life. There's multiple intelligences. There's so many rating scales and surveys. And so please, when you see an IQ number, know that it breaks down into a lot more, and try not to focus on that. LD is learning disability, neurologically based processing problems that can interfere with academic skills. And here's our LEA, local education agency. Here's the definition: school district operating public, primary, and secondary schools in the U.S. that does provide government services to schools within a local area. And it does happen in the United Kingdom too. I thought that was an interesting little factoid there as well. All right, LRE, least restrictive environment. And we're starting to see a lot of improvement in this area. IDEA states students who receive special education services are to be educated or included with non-disabled students in the general education setting to the maximum extent that's possible. And, I remember, back in the day, I started, this is my 21st year teaching, and, we were still finding life skill classes in the basement and next to the boiler rooms in some school districts 20 years ago. So we've come a long way to where we are able to include our kiddos to their tolerance, to their ability. We're seeing a lot of differentiated instruction. We're seeing adaptive seating. I mean, there's so many things we're starting to see now, and it has just progressed. I've seen a great progression over the last 20 years. As I'll never forget the day walking into the basement and I'm like, this is the boiler room. They're like, oh no, the next door is the life skills class. We've come a long way. MD, multiple disabilities. They're associated impairments such as intellectual disability, blindness. It's that combination of having those two disabilities, or intellectual disability and orthopedic impairment. MDR, this is another important term, an acronym that I like to go over: Manifestation Determination Review. It's a process to review all relevant information and the relations between a child's disability and their behavior. And we see these more commonly when a child is going through, that has a disability, in expulsion hearings, in suspension hearings. Legally, yes, they have to do this MDR to find out, is this a manifestation of the child's disability? How does this relate? Is the behavior not related? So they use, when I say they, the districts use all kinds of information to compile this report to see exactly, did the behavior occur because of the child's disability? MDT, that's your multidisciplinary team. It's a group of individuals for multiple disciplines who meet and evaluate the student for placement in special education and create an IEP. So we see these MDT teams when we're just starting out in special education with our loved one. We primarily rely on the IEP team after that. MTSS, multi-tiered system of support. So I always talk about the triangle, right? At the bottom of the triangle, we have everybody that's included in the bottom. And as we go up the tiers, we're looking at more intervention strategies. We're looking at more smaller group. We're looking at more individual, and we're really trying to meet students where they're at, using, a standards aligned comprehensive school improvement. And it's a framework. There's standardization there, there's scope and sequence, and it not just looks at academic, but also behavioral interventions and some SEL outcomes as well. And if you look at PBI, positive behavior interventions, it mocks or mirrors the same triangle. NCLB, I made some references to that earlier tonight. It's the reauthorization of ESEA, and this includes Title I provisions applying to disadvantaged students. NOREP, Notice of Recommended Educational Placement. And I kind of joke with parents. I said, if you're going to not sign any document, don't sign this one, if you're in disagreements, because this is the notice that parents receive that summarizes the recommendation for the school of where their child's placement and educational program will be. And so if you're not in agreement, or if you have any doubt, you have the right not to sign this document, because once you sign the document, your child will be placed there. And so I tell parents, read that over carefully and really look at what that says. And if you need help, please feel free to call me, because that's the one document. If you sign it, there they go. So really look at that. OCR, Office for Civil Rights. This is our office that enforces all our civil rights, just like it says, and it prohibits discrimination in federally funded programs and activities. ODD, Oppositional Defiance Disorder, and it's usually behavior related, and it's around defiant or uncooperative or hostile behaviors towards authority figures or peers. OHI, I like to take a real quick look at this because some of our kiddos, for example, blood clotting disorders, just because I'm a mom of two, they fall under here. If you look, hemophilia is there. It's not what my kids have, but it's very similar along lines. Also, our kiddos with ADHD, severe ADHD needs, they fall under this category well, as having a limited strength, vitality, alertness, including heightened sensory alertness, for these chronic or lifelong conditions. There are children that are very severely asthmatic. And so, their inclusion within the educational setting could be fatal, depending on the severity. And so those are provisions, and that's a category that children, with these type of disorders, conditions, they have that safeguard under OHI as a category for special needs. And again, has to adversely affect them in the educational setting. O&M, orientation and mobility. Services provided to the blind or visually impaired to safely move throughout the education and other environments. OI, orthopedic impairment. Severe orthopedic impairment that adversely affects the child's education performance. So let me give you an example here. Student who wears AFOs for issues with their knee, orthopedic issues with their knees. It's going to take them a lot longer to switch in between classes in high school, right? Than the 4 minutes, So I'm sure, that could be accommodation and modification there. And there's some, specifics there for that impairment. OSEP, Office of Special Education Programs. I encourage you to visit their website if you ever have any questions, legal questions, because they do explain a lot of good things, tips and tricks and things like that. I wish I should have linked that here, but they definitely are out to improve the results for individuals with disability from birth to now 22. OT, I don't know about you, but if it wasn't for my OT, she was amazing, helping my kiddos, a professional that provides therapy services based on engaging in meaningful activities of daily living, such as self-care, education, recreation, work, and social interaction. And I'm going to tell you right now, they do a lot more than what those words say. All right, another good touch point is PASA, Pennsylvania Alternative State Assessments. I touched a little bit about that earlier. It's designed for students with severe disabilities who are unable to participate meaningfully in the PSSA, even with accommodations. I like to talk about this for a little bit. There are 6 points that our guidance gives us that qualify the student or makes them eligible for the PASA. A lot of times families aren't aware of those 6 points. It's not explained to them. So I encourage you, when you're at the IEP meeting or you have any questions about state testing, look to see if your child qualifies for the alternative state assessment. That is what I give the students in my class. They have significant impairments involving autism and other related disorders and conditions. And so this is appropriate for them. Also for other reasons, they have significant modifications and accommodations to their programming. So that's something to look into, because I understand that the PSSA can be very stressful for our children. And I know I'm kind of hopping ahead a little bit to the PSSA, which is in the next slide, but that's the Pennsylvania state system for assessment. And it can be hard for some of our kiddos with special needs. PBS or PBIS, positive behavioral supports or positive behavior intervention supports, and a school-wide approach to improve school safety and promote positive behavior. Some of our kiddos with special needs need more than that, and that's great. They're included in school-wide, but they may need an individualized behavior plan or some other intervention. PECS, this would be a great example of low-tech assistive technology. Picture exchange communication system. It's alternative or augmentative communication. It was developed in the 85, and I didn't realize it was that long ago. First implemented with preschool students diagnosed with ASD, and it's using pictures to exchange, communicating wants, ideas, thoughts, feelings, requests. Present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. That is a huge section in our child's IEP. Statements written there that accurately describe the student's strengths, weakness, and learning styles. And this could be very, very long for some of our kiddos or very short for some of our kiddos, depending on their needs. PSSA, we talked about that already. It's a standard-based criterion reference assessment used to student attainment of academic standards while also identifying school programs that are proficient. Physical therapist or physical therapy. They are a professional. It's considered under related services, and it supports the students with motor development and helping just to participate in everyday routines and activities. All right, PTE or PTR, permission to evaluate or reevaluate. This is the document that you as a parent or caregiver would have to sign to give the district permission to evaluate your child. And so in some cases, depending on your child's disability category. It may happen every 3 years, or it may happen every 2 years. And for some disability categories, parents have the right to waive that evaluation. And so that would be a different document to sign. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, can happen after a traumatic or terrifying event in which physical or emotional harm was experienced, threatened, or witnessed. I think this is important to point out because, again, we're recognizing more and more how important mental health influences our students. PWN, prior written notice, a notice provided to parents when the school proposes to take action or refuses to take action regarding your child. Again, this is something very, very important to read, and you must receive prior written notice. If you don't, that's a red flag. Reevaluation, we talked a little bit about this earlier, that you have to sign for permission, and it's tests and observation conducted by the team to determine continued eligibility for special education and related services. Response to intervention, it's that multi-tiered system that I had mentioned earlier, also considered MTSS. It's standardized, and it looks for early identification and intervening for children with academic and behavioral risk. Supplementary aids and services, SAS, and these fall under our SDI, part of the IEP, which is specially designed instruction. And it's all the things, the supports, the services that your child needs to benefit from their educational setting. SB, spina bifida, it's a birth defect that occurs when the spine and the spinal cord do not come together properly. And we talked about SDI, adapted content, all the things that your child will need to have meaningful educational progress. SDL, specific learning disability. It impacts the ability to listen, think, speak, read, spell, mathematic calculations. And SPL, we talked about our speech and language therapist. They're a professional that works with communication, articulation, and oral motor skills. Special education. It's the practice of educating students in a way that addresses their individual needs and differences. And school-wide positive behavior, interventions, and support. Again, it goes back to that MTSS, that multi-tier of interventions. And this is surrounding more of the behavior and the social and emotional learning of our students. Traumatic brain injury, TBI. Physical damage to the brain that could result in physical, behavioral, or mental changes depending on which area of the brain is injured. And it's important because this could impact the student's education, and it could require special education services, whether temporary or permanent. I like to add that because that has happened. UDL, Universal Design for Learning. This is important. It's an approach to creating instructional material and activities that are accessible to all, rather than simply adapting existing curriculum materials to provide access for individuals with disabilities. And I always think of it this way: we all learn differently, we all express things differently, and we all receive information differently. And this should allow for multiple means of expression, representation, and engagement. Just means that we're all different learners and we do things differently, and that should be respected. VI, visual impairment. Impairment, envision that even with correction, adversely affects the child's educational performance. All right, so that's the end of my slideshow this evening. And I know it's going to leave some time for questions. Masha, do we have some time for those?
Yes, absolutely. If everyone wants to hang on for a couple more minutes, feel free to send your question in the chat, or you can unmute as well to ask your question. And there was one question too about whether your slides will be shared. I know we'll have the recording of this. So if we can share your slides as well, that would be great.
Sure.
And one question, if nobody has one that was submitted ahead of time, was what terms should community resource specialists and educators know in order to better serve their communities?
Well, I'll be honest. The terms that I shared tonight are, I would say, a snippet of all the terms. So these are the more prominent terms that we see daily or very frequently in special education. And there are so many other terms. They also vary by state and Commonwealth. So if somebody's in another state, the terms and acronyms might be slightly different. So I would use this as a start, but it's not an end all be all.